Hello, everyone. In today's Statistics and Decision Making Experiential Learning, we will be discussing the topic on inflation. Today's presentation is brought to you by Neil Mirchandani, that is myself, and Ajay Vasista. So, we come to the major question. What is inflation? Inflation can be defined as the rise in prices, which can be translated as the decline of purchasing power over time. That means that with an increase in price, the number of people that will purchase that particular good or commodity will decrease. The rate at which purchasing power drops can be reflected in the average price increase of a basket of selected goods and services over some period of time. It is one of the most important economic terms that now exist. It has been able to plunge countries into long periods of instability. This loss of purchasing power impacts the cost of living for the common public, which ultimately leads to a deceleration in economic growth. This is how the GDP is largely impacted because of inflation. The consensus view among economists is that sustained inflation occurs when a nation's money supply growth outpaces economic growth. That means the nation is spending more money in producing the supply, but it is receiving less when it comes to economic earnings. The rates of inflation vary from year to year and from currency to currency because of different reasons as such. Aiming for low and stable inflation is typically a key objective for monetary policy. As you can see in this graph is the US dollar inflation rate, which is measured by the December to December change in the US Consumer Price Index. Since 1950, it has ranged from a low of minus 0.7% in 1954 to a high of 13.3% in 1979. This period, which is basically from January 1965 to December 1982, is termed as the Great Inflation. Since 1991, the rate has stayed between 1.6% and 3.3%, as can be seen in this graph. So, after the Great Inflation, you can see that the inflation rate has remained at a steady constant rate between 1.6% to 3.3% per year. Now, measurement of inflation. Broadly considered, there are two main rationales for measuring inflation. First, inflation reduces welfare. It causes hindrances to people and families when they have to, buy something that is of great importance or a necessity. If the prices increase, the problems also increase. Second, inflation provides an indication of the degree of slack or short term developments in the economy. That means that we can see or we can determine the nation's economic growth by keeping a check on inflation. It is important to measure inflation in a transparent and credible way, one that is understood by different constituencies of society. There are two primary ways that the inflation is measured. First, consumer price index, and the second is a personal consumption expenditure PCE. Consumer price index. The consumer price index, by definition, basically measures the overall change in consumer prices based on a representative basket of goods and services over time. It is the price of a weighted average market basket of consumer goods and services produced by households. Let's say now that the prices have increased by 9% over the past 12 months, which includes that the cost of haircuts have increased by 6.3% since last summer, and also the price of chicken has increased by over 19% in the past year. So, this that you see, the average of this is what the CPI tracks. Now, these are the steps to produce CPI. The first one, we construct price indexes for products from individual observations of the price of the respective products. And the second, we will construct an upper level and top level aggregates as weighted averages of the product indexes. So to calculate weights, the formula is given as weights is equal to the adjusted budget shares multiplied by the base period budget shares. So these particular weights allow the overall index to track the cost of the basket purchased in the base period. The formula for calculating the cost price index is given by cost of basket upon cost of basket in base year total multiplied by 100. Now, this basket is basically a representation of consumer spending patterns, and the change in its price represents the rate of inflation faced by consumers as a whole. This pie chart shows the different components measured by the consumer price index. So, food and beverages is measured by about 14.3%. The majority part, that is housing, is measured by about 42.4%. Then we have apparel, that is 2.5%. 18.2% is covered by transportation, 8.5% medical care, 5.1% recreation, 6.4% education and communication, and this remaining small portion of 2.7% is basically the other goods and services. Now, this graph that you see is the All India Consumer Price Index numbers for agricultural and rural laborers that is recorded from October 2021 to October 2022. Now, from October 2021, the general inflation rate has gone from 3.12% to over 7.34% in October 2022. And if you talk of food inflation, it has gone from 0.59% to a whopping 7% in October 2022. Now, personal consumption expenditures. The personal consumption expenditures price index PCE tracks the changes in prices of consumer goods and services. It is almost exactly what CPI does, but there are key differences between the two. First one, CPI sources data from consumers while PCE sources from businesses. The PCE tracks all items that the population consumes and not just those you pay for out of your pocket, unlike CPI. PCE analyzes what businesses are selling, whereas the CPI just follows what households are buying. The CPI tracks medical services, service expenses that consumers pay for, whereas the PCE also includes healthcare services that are paid for by an employer, sponsored health insurance plan, Medicare, or Medicaid. Let's take an instance. Broccoli. The prices of broccoli, let's say they go skyrocketing. So a normal person would not go for broccoli, but instead they would prefer purchasing cauliflower because this would be at a lesser price. Now, this is what is picked up by the PCE price index. Wholesale price index. This used to be one of the most popularly used form of inflation rate calculation methodology in India, but it was later preferred over by CPI. The wholesale price index it used to calculate wholesale inflation. This inflation rate is often known as headline inflation. This is released by the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Now, this is why wholesale price index is not so popular in India. Though the Reserve Bank of India, RBI, used WPI for most of its policy decisions before 2014, the WPI based inflation calculation was not false proof. WPI shows the combined price of a commodity basket comprising of about only 676 items. It does not include services, and it neither reflects the bottlenecks between producer and wholesaler nor between wholesaler and retailer, which resulted in a large number of delays. Hence, from 2014, as part of the reforms initiated by RBI Governor Raghu Ram Rajan, RBI shifted to CPI for policy decisions. Now, I will be handing this over to my colleague, Ajay Vasista, who will now continue with this presentation.
Now let us discuss about the causes of inflation. It is very important to know inflation with the interaction between supply and demand Too much demand or too little supply can mean higher prices and inflation for everybody. Inflation can impact many things besides cost, such as employment and wages. It majorly depends upon demand and supply, which can be categorized into three things. The first one is demand pull, second one is cost push, and the third one is inflation expectations. Let us look into demand pull first. Demand pull inflation occurs when the total supply does not meet the total demand, or the demand for goods and services is greater than the supply. In the graph, we can see when the supply is low, the price levels are very high. Why does it happen? Why aggregate demand might increase? Because there is an increase in spending by consumers, business, or governments. An increase in net exports as a result, demand for goods and services will increase relative to their supply. At the same time, in order to meet the increasing demand, firms will employ more workers, and to attract new staffs and retain their existing employees, the firms will also have to offer higher wages. Consequently, these firms may also have to increase the prices of their goods and services to cover their higher labor costs. With more jobs and higher wages, household income grows, which boosts consumer spending. This leads to a rise in the aggregate demand, giving businesses more scope to raise the price of their goods and services. When this happens across a large number of businesses and sectors, this leads to an increase in inflation. uh, we can see in the image the aggregate demand increases demand for workers, which provides them wages with firms prices, higher prices. Let us discuss about cost push inflation now. Cost push inflation happens when there is a decline in aggregate supply of goods and services, and the aggregate demand remains unchanged or even grows, driving prices and inflation higher. In the graph, we can see as the aggregate supply is low, the price levels are very high since the demand is low. When the price of imported inputs increase, the production costs are pushed up. Due to the increase in production costs, the firms tend to produce a lower level of output and in turn raise the price of their goods and services. This increase in production costs have flow-on effects. For example, an increase in the price of oil, which is a major input in many sectors of economy used by vehicles, will initially lead to higher petrol prices, causes uh, more expensive to transport goods from one location to another, which in turn will result in increased prices for items like groceries. Okay, let us look at the effects of higher oil prices. First, it affects the consumer. Higher prices causes low living standards, inflation, rise in cost push inflation. Current account oil importers will see bigger current defect. Long-term incentives, firms will seek to develop alternatives to oil. Alternatives, people may switch to other companies. Alternatives, investment firms may cut back on investment. Economic growth likely to cause economic growth to slow down. Let us look at the graph of price of crude oil in India from April 2014 to September 2021. In April 14, it was at $105.56, which decreased to 28.08, and by Jan 2016, it reached its lowest point. And from there, we can see a gradual increase of in their prices. In October 2018, it reached to $80.08 dollars, and it reached the lowest price in April 2020, having $19.90, because of COVID, as we all know. And it again gradually started increasing. By September 2021, it reached to $73. Okay, another reason for the rise of cost push inflation, uh, maybe because of weather or natural disasters like cyclones and floods that damage large volumes of agricultural produce and result in significant increases in price of processed food and both takeaway and restaurant meals, resulting in temporary periods of higher inflation. For example, the floods in Pakistan, which led to complete destruction of fields and crops. The third point, inflation expectations. Inflation expectations are the beliefs that households and firms have about future price increases. It is important because expectations about future price increases can affect current economic decisions that can influence actual inflation outcomes. Here we can see in the image the person having expectations or believes that how the value might increase. Example, if firms expect the future inflation to be higher and act on those beliefs, they may raise the price of their goods and services at a faster rate. Similarly, if workers expect future inflation to be higher, they may demand higher wages to make up for the expected loss of their purchasing power. This behavior, sometimes is called as inflation psychology, can contribute to a higher rate of actual inflation, so that expectations about inflation become self-fulfilling. Okay, what is negative inflation? It is nothing but the opposite of inflation. It occurs when the cost of goods across a country fall, because supply of goods in is higher than the demand for those goods, but can also have to do with the buying power of money becoming greater. In the graph, we can see the deflation from September 2020 to September 2021. Um, it gradually kept decreasing, and after September 2021 it gradually increased up to 6.95 percentage. Let us look at the graph of inflation rates from 1987 to 2027. Um, from the beginning in 1987 it was about 9.06 percentage, which gradually kept decreasing to 4.57 percentage at in the year 1989, which drastically increased to 13.48 percentage by 1991. And we can see that that is the peak highest gone till upcoming years, and it reached its lowest point in 2018, up to going to 3.6 percentage, and by 2021 it got up to 6.89 percentage. And from there they have predicted that it might decline to 4.36 percentage by 2025, and 4.56 percentage by 2027. Graph product basket contains products and services on which the average consumer spends money throughout the year. They include expenses of groceries, clothes, rent, power, telecommunications, recreational activities, and raw materials, as well as federal fees and taxes. In 2022, the inflation rate in India was around 6.89 percentage compared to the previous year. From the year 1960 to 2020, the inflation peaked in the year 1974 at inflation rate of 28.6 percentage, which is highest inflation rate between the year 1960 to 2021. In the year 1976, the inflation hit the lowest level of minus 7.7 percentage, which is the lowest as we saw on the graph. The average inflation in India from year 1960 to 2021 is seen to be 7.55 percentage. So on an average, the Indian currency is losing value at a rate of 7.5 percentage. Let us compare between India and United States of trajectory inflations. There is a drastic changes here between India and United States. In the year 2018 October, India was at 3.38 percentage of inflation, and it uh, we can see it kept gradually decreasing first, and kept increasing until it reached the year 2020 with 7.61 percentage of inflation, and by 2021 it dropped to 4.48 because of the pandemic. Whereas in United States it was at 2.50 percentage, which pretty much went uh, without changing till 2019, and from there we can see a sudden drop in that. It reached the rock bottom, and by 2020 it reached to 1.20 percentage, and from there we can see a gradual increase until October 2021 with 6.20 percentage. Now let us look at inflation due to COVID-19. Inflation had raised heights. There was an absolute uncertainty that prevailed throughout the world. The basic commodities which needed to be at cheaper rates during the pandemic were also sold at higher rates, which made survival for the poor even more difficult. Businesses had to pass on the expenses on raw materials to customers in the form of higher prices, since the cost of the raw materials used to manufacture an item uh, service increased. Economics refers to this as cost push inflation, as the supply did not match the demand. Uh, what were the causes on food items effect on it? Let us look into that. We saw a steady boost in the prices of food commodities everywhere. The prices of edible oil, pulses, and gas touched the sky during the pandemic, making it difficult to meet the requirements. Edible oil, which is an essential part of cooking food, has been raised by 40%, even though the prices of pulses have increased. Not only this, the prices of gas has also increased, making it difficult for the common man to meet its need. Uh, when we come to the graph spikes in food inflation in India between 2019 to December 2022, it was at minus 2.24 percentage in Jan, which gradually kept increasing till next year Jan having 13.63 percentage, and from there we can see a gradual decline in inflation, and pretty much did not change till October having 11%. From there we can see a drastic decline to 3.41 percentage by the month December. Yeah, thank you.
That's all for this video statistical report on inflation. Thank you.